Welcome to the Flux, where we hear stories from people who've asked what-if questions to better understand the world and talk about how data can help tell stories that impact decisions and create an intentional impact on the future. This is your host, John Cordier, CEO at Epistemics. In a world where the flux capacitor from Back to the Future does not yet exist, people have to make difficult decisions without always knowing how the future will play out. Our guests are people who've taken risks, made decisions when uncertainty was high, and who have assisted decision makers by using data and models. We hope you can turn lessons from our podcast into foresight so you or your organization can make better decisions and create an intentional impact for others. Welcome to the next episode of The Flux. Today, we're on with Rob Axtell of George Mason University, where he runs the largest graduate program in agent-based simulation on the planet and gets to work on some really cool stuff. Rob, glad to have you on today.
Okay, thanks for the introduction, John, and happy to be here talking to you guys about ABM and other things. Yeah, as John said, at George Mason, we have been running for about 15 years a Ph.D. program in Computational Social Science, of which one of the most important aspects of that is agent-based modeling and its various flavors of related things like social networks, et cetera. It is the case that at any instant in time, we have about 50 Ph.D. students. And over the last 15 years, we've graduated almost 100. I think something less than 100, but we're approaching 100 soon, graduates with CSS. Let me just say also by way of background that at George Mason, we have a Center for Social Complexity, which is a kind of a research arm of our normal educational programs. And we also have, for this Center for Social Complexity, more theoretical focus, does a lot of big picture things. When we get people coming in who say they want to do more policy things, then we have a little kind of computational policy lab that can be used for small-scale government projects or a little investigation that we want maybe just to do a one-off on. But overall, a couple of different research centers and a degree program, and that's the work that we do at George Mason.
Awesome. Rob, what do most of the students go into after they go through one of those programs? Is it mainly on the government side, or have you seen more of a mix of government and commercial lately?
Yeah, it's a great question, John, and I think over time, it's been ebbs and flows a little bit. Of the 50 PhD students, a non-trivial fraction of them, let's say 15 to 20 of them, are going to be part-time students who work in Washington somewhere, right? At one of the big agencies, or maybe for DOD or something. And we have several military officers come through our program, for example, and go on to teach at the Naval Postgraduate School or at the Naval Academy or somewhere. It is the case that some of the students are part-time, so those part-time students, of course, are going to go back to their home base of operations and then it's typically giving them time off to do the degree. But of the ones who are full-time, I would say over time, it's been a pretty stable mix of maybe 1/3 people going into government, whether it be traditional, become a government employee, or it could be something more like, somebody might just go into, say, the DOD contractor base, where you're working for the government, but through contractors. About 1/3 of our graduates have gone into some form of research, pure research, academia / think tank world. I love to put the RAND Corporation into that group, and maybe MITRE, depending on how you count them. I think you said you've had Matt Kohler on before. Matt's in the works for MITRE. And then 1/3 are going to be in the private sector, John, including people at startups. So there could be a variety of social network startups, and maybe not so much ABM startups like how I think at Epistemics, but that's coming on the horizon too, I think, but more just kind of startups associated with some maybe machine learning or something like that. So overall, something like 1/3 academic research, 1/3 private sector, and then 1/3 government is certainly an approximate way to think about where our graduates have gone.
Cool. Before we talk about more things from the program and complex social systems, agent-based modeling, and some things you're excited about, is there a story that you have that got you into agent-based simulation or modeling complex systems? Like, how did you get started?
I've been around so long, I'm such an antique that I was there a little bit at the founding of ABM. Maybe a relevant question is something like, what got me into the study of complex systems? And there's a very clear answer. And that in the late 80s, I was a natural scientist mostly, but with an interest in policy and economics. And the way it actually worked was that when the microcomputer revolution first happened, and all of us are migrating from our mainframe Fortran compilers over, I was very excited about the burgeoning nonlinear dynamic stuff on chaos and Mandelbrot set and all the cool graphics that were happening at the time. And that led me to the Santa Fe Institute. So as a graduate student even, So I guess somewhere around 1990, as a PhD student at Carnegie Mellon, I attended SFI's, it was called the first winter school on complex systems. And it
Okay.
turned out to be the only winter school, I think, because back then SFI didn't really have a building, and so that was held at the University of Arizona, and it was held between the fall and spring, and it was held in like January or something. It was a great session, though, and where Murray Gell-Mann spoke about scaling laws for cities, and Jeff West was there speaking about quantum field theory, but also there were good talks by other founders of complex systems, like Mitch Feigenbaum came and spoke about period doubling bifurcations, and Michael Fisher came and spoke about the renormalization. Anyway, so the great exposure to complexity. And from there, after I finished graduate school in '92, I went to Brookings, and Josh Epstein and I began working together. And we immediately jumped into what we thought we were doing artificial life, which at that time was a kind of a just up and coming field. We thought we were doing artificial life for social science, where the artificial life had been mostly applied to biology at that time. So we thought we were doing A life for social science. In fact, by the way, the original name of the Sugarscape model in all of our first documents, we just called it artificial social life, as if there would only be one model and you'd be done. Not knowing that there would be many models you want to write of artificial agents doing social science things. So that was the start of everything, I think, with computing and ABM, et cetera. Of course, back then we didn't have the word ABM. As I said, we were calling it artificial life type modeling.
Okay.
But to me, that was the start. And I should just say that it was obviously quite different. It was clear to me once it got going that it was quite different from what I had done before, in the sense that most of my graduate school training had been in mathematical economics. And in math economics, you solve for what is the market clearing price, or you figure out what sets of quantities are going to make a firm profitable or whatever. You solve for an answer and you get the answer. And when Josh and I first drew out the Sugarscape model on a napkin, and then I got it going in a simple little Pascal C dialect running on a early Mac computer, the fact that the model just ran and ran and never had any final, it never spit out like an answer of 3.14 or 42. It just kept running. That was quite novel, and I remember it. I still can remember at the time thinking, like, this is quite different than just doing numerical computation. Right? This is something that is using computing in a different way altogether.
When you see students come to the program, are there common models that gave them their individual aha moments? Or what are some of since like the early 1990s that you've seen get more people into agent-based simulation or complex systems modeling?
Yeah. I would say that there's definitely a subset of them who have come to our program who have read the Sugarscape book and can see how it could naturally be applied to other things that they care about. So the Sugarscape model is a point of departure, not because it's going to give them the answers they want, but because they can see how to use the ideas, right? It's also the case that I think that people understand the Schelling model as if they're being very foundational. The Schelling segregation model is a way to think about how people are not homogeneously distributed across space or time. And so people who want to work on the issue of inequality would naturally be drawn to the Schelling model. So. And then Josh and I did some work on the spontaneous formation of classes, which is along similar lines. But I think these days, there's such a large number of ABMs in so many different social science domains that it would be very common for someone to say, I'm coming to your program because I saw a model of this or that and the other, which I'm somewhat expert. I'm a tax specialist. We now have ABMs that we use for this or that. So I want to learn how to do that. Or I'm an environmental scientist and we have an ABM of a fishery or something. I want to figure out how to do that. So basically, they'll come having seen ABM in some form, and they say, obviously, what they're going to do in graduate school is gain the skill to be able to pursue that.
Okay. Are there fields that you've seen more people come up with that people weren't trying to get into and apply agent-based modeling in the last 10 years or so?
Good question. And I think that speaks a little bit down to the design of our program. And let me just say just 1 second of background of that. And that's at time zero, we really tried to span the social sciences. So we had one person for each social science, from politics, sociology, anthropology, geography. We tried to have somebody from every different field who would be capable of advising the students. And I would handle the ones who want to do economics and finance primarily. Over time, I think it's fair to say that we've had more from some fields and less from others. And so we no longer try to support all fields. For example, being in Washington here, we do have a fair number of people doing, say, international relations in politics. Mm-hmm. But it's less common, I would say, that people doing kind of American politics or doing traditional politics. We have had some people who work on anthropology, less in sociology. I'm not exactly sure why. And then of course, we have quite a number who are working in both economics, finance, and also other ones in geography. Yeah, but it is that's some kind of self-selection, right? People come to us wanting to do certain things, but it's not the case that we have equal numbers of students in all those different areas these days.
Sure. With the background on the more finance and economic side of modeling, is there like a subfield or a new area that you're really excited about people exploring or you're exploring yourself?
Yeah, good point. Yeah, good question. I think that those fields that have a lot of data available are naturally attractive in the sense that they're going to help us. Those data will help us figure out which models are the best ones. So it turns out that as of right now, the areas that are just having a giant change in the data structure are things like all manner of kind of consumer behavior, consumer sentiment. What do consumers purchase? There are commercial data sets developed about that. There are various government data sets relevant. So I think that trying to build better models of consumer behavior, that's an important topic growing rapidly. But then those same data and those models can be used to do similar things in other areas. For example, things like macroeconomists always want to know what people are spending their money on and what people buying durable goods or people using credit to people buying financial assets, et cetera. The fact that we have ever better models on those things means that, for example, there always has been a field of agent-based macroeconomics, going way back into the early 90s. The late Professor Axel Leinhoff at UCLA ran several workshops in the 90s about agent-based macro. Now, but those macro models are always very small. They were like a few thousand agents or something. But today we can do much larger, more high-fidelity models. So agent-based macro has gone from being relatively speculative, kind of just a small-scale affair, to being much more empirically grounded, much larger scale now. So that's something which is a big change on the horizon, very exciting, I think.
Yeah. Is just the scale something that you believe has held agent-based modeling back from other fields getting more traction? If you look at 10 years ago, people were talking about machine learning, and you see a lot more machine learning specific graduate programs even popping up now. So there's the scale factor, there's the connecting ABMs to actual data factor. What are some other things that you believe have held agent-based modeling back that now that are being solved for create a brighter future for the complex social systems, ABM?
I think the fact that we have more data now should mean the whole thing should accelerate. And to be totally honest about it, in some of these areas, in order for an agent-based model to gain traction, it has to basically outcompete the best, say, mathematical model or other kinds of model. And because those other models have had a large investment of time and effort, et cetera, in them, we have not had comparable level of investment. Only now are we able to compete. For example, I think it's only now, in the last year or two, that the agent-based macro models have been able to make a run at the state-of-the-art, what are called DSGE models that the central bankers think about. The U.S. Federal Reserve Board, or in the UK it'd be the Bank of England. The way that the central banks use models, they traditionally use a very low-dimensional numerical models, not agent-based, numerical ones, but which have a lot of investment in statistical estimation and grounding in data in them. So even though what those models do basically is model one agent in elaborate detail, saying what does a representative UK consumer do? How much does he or she work? How much does she invest in retirement versus current consumption? How much do you invest in financial assets, et cetera? So measure one very complicated agent is only now are we able to come up with models that are empirically able to compete with those highly polished central bank models that have been used for a couple of decades now. Yeah, so I think that holding back ABM historically, because it was both the computing and the data, but now it seems like we have enough computing, and so the availability of the data is really letting things take off.
Okay. A lot of the listeners on this podcast, they're coming at it from a number of different types of fields. When you look at the competition of agent-based models versus other types of models, if you wanted to give a 30,000-foot view on what types of questions are really good for an agent-based model rather than a more traditional statistical or mathematical model, it would be great to hear your take on that.
Okay, yeah. So I guess one kind of zeroth order question, or zeroth order answer to your good question, John, which is that certainly in the social science domain, people who are card-carrying social scientists typically, not always, but typically, are going to prefer models where the resolution is going to be at the level of individual actors, individual people. You might want to have a model where there are groups of actors, like a firm or something, But typically, you want to have the individual behaviors in there somewhere. So the first thing to say is that neural network or other kind of, maybe let's call them reduced form models of social phenomena, oftentimes, even though they may be accurate in some sense, they may be useful for forecasting, they're oftentimes not very useful for understanding, for gaining an understanding of how a system's working, simply because we have no way to interpret what the weights are, what the parameters mean. Right? In general, we like having models with large numbers, or with individual actors represented. That makes it means loading naturally in an ABM world in that sense. Now, having said that, it's also the case that you can imagine, say, a small number of agents or a larger number of them, and maybe that you can get by for certain questions with representative agents. I could say, I just need to have 10 types of agents, poor, medium, middle class, upper class, top 1%, top tenth of 1%, and I can represent the whole U.S. inequality distribution or something. I mean, there may be times when you don't need to have every individual in a model, and you can still do okay. But having said that, I think I personally always err on the side of saying, look, if we had enough computing, there's no reason, if we had enough computing and enough data, why wouldn't we model every person? That just seems natural to do. I'm thinking like over to, you mentioned other disciplines, over to epidemiology. Obviously, if we think about diseases living on people, it's probably possible to do good things, right, with only, say, 100-to-1 representation of a population. But if you really want to get at how diseases propagate, you really need to have a 1-to-1 representation of that population. So I think that over the next decade, what we're going to basically see is full-scale models in which every person is represented, simply because there's no reason not to do that if you have all the data and you have enough computing, right? Now, historically, we never had enough data, or never have had enough computing. So we're on this cusp right now, and we're going through the transition. And I think that, yes, there are still reasons why you want to use models that reduce scale, but let's just say those reasons are becoming fewer and fewer over time.
So if the agent-based modeling community is at somewhat of a tipping point or inflection point, what are some commonly held beliefs in a world where that level of highly granular, large-scale data was unavailable versus now that it is, or soon will be? Are there some like older types of thinking in the modeling community that you think need to get brought up to speed, or are there any commonly held beliefs that you disagree with?
Yeah. Maybe I'll just, let me, first part of your question, John, is being ABM versus non-ABM modeling communities. And just to say that it certainly is, I think, from the natural, particularly people trained, oftentimes people who are ABMers come from some natural science training or have a good computing background. And it is the case that in many areas of natural sciences, also in computer science, you can get by with using averages, using typical values. You can oftentimes abstract from maybe the outliers by saying, what does the representative person do or something. I think that at least when it comes to the social world in general, but also economics and finance in particular, it does seem to me that there are very important areas where things like mean values are barely meaningful, and average values, and things like second higher moments are simply not useful because they're basically noise statistics. And I always use the following example, which is due to one of my colleagues at George Mason named Ken Comer. Ken always uses the following example. He says, imagine that there's 80,000 people at a big football stadium, and the average height of the people in the stadium is 5'9", and in walks one of the tallest men in the world, Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. And Jabbar will modify the average height of people in the stadium by only a very small amount. Jabbar he's not even 2 feet taller. He's not 7'9". He's 7'2" or 3 or something, right? So he's going to divide 2 feet over 80,000 people. It's only going to be a tiny fourth decimal point adjustment. But now imagine you're in the stadium, and the average income or wealth in that stadium is, say, $200,000 or something. Average income of $70,000, average wealth of $200,000, just throwing out numbers. But in walks Bill Gates. Now, what Bill Gates does is he actually raises the average income up to the $1 million mark, and he raises the average wealth up to something very high also. In the real social world, we have these very skew distributions that are so skew that oftentimes the variance term does not exist. You can always compute it for finite data, but it doesn't really exist. And so the mean value may or may not be meaningful. But this is the distribution of cities, the distribution of firm sizes, the distribution of words and how commonly they're used. And used 1 million times more frequently than indivisible or something, right? So the idea is that throughout the social world, humans create these gigantic for lack of a better term, I would call them inequalities. Word frequency is not really, there's no pejorative associated with inequality. We're just saying some words used more commonly. And so I think that one thing that the ABM can really do for us is by representing the entire distribution of a population, we can properly represent the heterogeneity that's there. And that's something which is basically lost on anybody who tries to do any kind of model, in particular a social science model, with a mean and a variance. At least the ABM community can really help better understand, I think, the real world when you can say we need to understand who's out in the tails and how do the tails matter, et cetera. But now, if I also parse your question, though, is what is it in the ABM world that people don't get right? And that may be that I think that we can build models today that are highly empirically grounded. And there is still this perception, whether both in the ABM world and without, that it's a mostly toy model. The Schelling model is a toy model of segregation. It's not a model of how or why Detroit has a bright line across 8 Mile Road for white people living north of 8 Mile and black people living south of 8 Mile Road. So I think it's fair to say that, as you said, we're on a cusp, John, right now of transition. And a lot of the ABMers still are not fully equipped to build empirically grounded models. And that's something that with synthetic populations and other things, which I know you guys know a lot about, we can certainly do a much better job of that going forward.
Going back to one of your earlier points where some fields just accept working with averages, where others might be getting beyond that. In your professional career, have you seen times when people have been basing decisions on averages and have gotten things totally wrong, where looking back, had you been able to apply an agent-based model or a simulation to that would capture more of the variance, could have solved some not so great downstream consequences?
Yeah, I think there are many examples. I'm just going to give you a quick and dirty one. Is that so put yourself back in like 2007, 8, 9 time frame, and there are a lot of commentators in newspapers saying things like, "Oh yes, we know that there are all these subprime mortgages being written. Yes, we know there are a bunch of borrowers who are getting houses with 1% down or 0% down, but don't worry about it because it's only 1 or 2 or 3% of mortgages, and so even if they blow up, it's not going to bring down the whole market." Right? That was the logic, which is not quite the same thing as the average. It's an averaging argument in the sense that it says that, look, the average mortgage does not include anything subprime, so don't sweat it. Mm-hmm. But what those comments totally lost or totally missed was the idea that the way that the secondary mortgage markets were at that time bundling mortgages was to say, look, okay, there's a bunch of these high-quality mortgages, but they're not going to pay very much interest. So let's actually bundle the high-quality ones with some subprime ones just so that people can take a little bit more risk, get a little bit higher return. And that's fine as long as the returns are, as long as those subprimes are not blowing up and basically causing the other mortgages, the mortgage investment products on which the healthy mortgages are based, to blow up. Then it's fine. But of course, what did happen was enough of the subprime stuff went south that the entire secondary mortgage market developed significant problems. And even though those subprime mortgages, both numerically in terms of how many there were and also in their dollar value, were a very small slice of the overall mortgage market. The fact that they were bundled with other ones really, in essence, caused the financial crisis of 2000. It really manifested itself in the fall of 2008, right when the election was happening, Obama's first election. But it had started before the year before that, and it took another year to unwind. And then we had the Great Recession that took a long time to get out of. So anyway, so that was a very concrete example where people who you can see economic commentators in the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, et cetera, in 2007 and 8 saying, don't sweat it. These, on average, these subprime mortgages are not going to matter much. So, and then that turned out to be completely wrong.
So the name of our podcast is The Flux, named after the flux capacitor from Back to the Future. And so we would jokingly call that a what the flux kind of moment. Are there things going on today where you think we might be in one of those what the flux type moments where we should be running more simulations, trying to understand what's going on in the world and how things might play out into the future?
That's a good question. I think everybody feels that, right? If you compare, for example, right now, compare 2024 to, say, 2004, things look a lot different on the international scene and in terms of stability of even U.S. democracy. It might be that simulations would help on some of that stuff. Not positive. It is the case that the DoD runs lots of simulations of outcomes of different wars, et cetera. I don't have a security clearance, so I'm not privy to say anything that's probably very deep about that. But I will say that it does always seem to me that, for example, we have an election coming up, and people would put a lot of stock in the 538.com or Nate Silver's predictions. But those are just one simulation that you can imagine running based on the polling data. You can imagine running a lot of other simulations, so-called. So I guess maybe in that case, it seems like more would be better, that we shouldn't have everything coming down to just one or a few models. We should have more models of that stuff running. I guess I do think that when it comes to things like overall international financial stability, it probably is the case that we have too few predictive models. Just as a concrete example, things like when you say what kind of event, today we know how to run so-called do shock testing or do stress testing of banks, or say even like mortgagees. If somebody lost their job, would be able to keep paying their mortgage, that kind of stuff. We know a lot about when idiosyncratic shocks hit financial institutions. What we know less about are potentially large-scale shocks hitting an entire financial system when everything is interlinked and stuff. So some work of that type is going on, but my sense is probably we know too little about that. It would be useful to know what are the vulnerabilities. Now, it may be the case that, once again, I don't have a security clearance. Maybe there's stuff going on in the background, and it's very important that not be reported. What is the most vulnerable part of the financial system? It's good that nobody really understands that, because otherwise people might attack it or something. I don't know. But I guess the main thing to say is that just a general issue, it seems to me, John, is that when it comes to policy, okay, it has not been the case that policies are made after the conduct of a large number of computational simulations, say. Rather, policy is typically made from the point of view of saying, this is a good idea. There's a deontic, that is, there's a reason to do it for some reason of right or wrong, or good or bad, or some philosophical reason. Oftentimes we don't, though, understand what are the secondary effects, right? What can emerge as an unintended consequence? Now, it seems to me that relatively rudimentary models that we could build would, in fact, show up. It would show us things like what are the unintended consequences, right? So I think that across the entire policy spectrum, policies being largely made by lawyers, largely being numerical, that is, they're not very good with numbers. I think just as a contrast, there's a stipulation in the DoD code somewhere. I don't remember the exact number, but something like every project over X $1 million, which actually used to be like 25 million. I think it's higher now. Maybe every project over $100 million with some threshold. Before you build it, before you have the contract on it, you got to build a simulation of it to say, is this idea even feasible? Is it even going to work, right? You're going to redesign the aircraft carrier to do something or other. Is it going to be possible? Well, you build a simulation of it to see if is the whole thing going to be viable or not. So for engineering projects, we have this requirement that simulations be built in advance to assess their feasibility. We don't have that for policy. And I think in a world where we, the modeling community, could provide low-cost simulations to all manner of users, this could become very viable, but we don't have that today.
Absolutely. Using the financial crisis of 2007, 8, 9 example, some of these simulations, it might require a little bit of a signal to get some momentum built behind it and for some people to really start paying attention to it. If we look at COVID and Neil Ferguson's model, there was some early signal that then tipped off a whole bunch of other people getting into it. What right now do you see are those early warning signs that could provide signal to then kick the modeling community off to going into understanding something that might be a year, 2, 3 years out on the horizon?
Yeah.
Or is it just people getting lucky?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that if I knew the answer to that, I could invest a bunch of money and make some money out of it. I don't know the answer to it, but it's a good question. Let me just say that as a footnote, as another way to non-answer your question, I'll say that when I was a graduate student, I interacted a fair amount with Herbert Simon, and one of the things that Herbert Simon's great dicta in life was, he said that the hardest thing for a researcher, the hardest thing in a researcher's career, is not necessarily doing the work or not necessarily learning some new technique or programming language or whatever. The hardest thing is knowing what the right problems to work on are, because until you do the work, you don't know what's going to come out the other end, right? It's basic research. It's a little bit similar to what your question was. Like, if I knew over the remainder of the 2020s, what are going to be the key pressure points on which the coherence of our society depends, and if I knew the answer to that, then I could figure out a good, strong research agenda. But I don't know the answer to that, so it's a little bit unclear what the right research agenda is. So yeah, I think that you're right. Maybe a different way to say it is that once COVID was obviously going to become a thing, Ferguson et al. Realized that they could morph their flu model over to something that would be useful for non-pharmaceutical interventions, and that became obviously something that made sense to do. But like even 3 months earlier, that was not obvious that was the right thing to do. So these things are always going to be knowing the right thing to do depends a lot on the context. And as of right now, we have a pretty jumbled context. It's not obvious where the big pressure points are coming up, but surely there will be some, but we don't know them.
We talked with Josh a little bit about inverse generative modeling. We talked with a couple of others about applications of some large language models informing agents and agents informing some LLMs, and even looking at when you run a parameter sweep, how do you understand those different range of outcomes that could come out of the same model? Are there any other, I guess, technical advances that you're really excited about or would want to highlight, whether they're at George Mason or somewhere else, that you think others in the modeling community should be paying more attention to?
Yeah, so that's another great question, hard question. I think I fully support Josh and other people to do the inverse generative social science. I think it's very hard to do it. And I think that's a little bit like, when you think about presumably a simpler problem like Newton working on gravity, and before him Kepler, before him Copernicus, over time they developed ideas about what gravity was, and basically they took innovations of a philosophical kind to actually make that better. And then of course Einstein comes along and says all that stuff is naive anyway, and here's how it really works. And now we know today that dark energy and dark matter means even Einstein is wrong, right? So I guess my point is just to say that we don't have any principled way to go from data to model. That's the kind of inverse problem, right? The forward problem is, given the model, how can I spin it forward and then compare it to the data? That's relatively straightforward. But the inverse problem, that's what science is about, right? Science is about, I've got this pattern on here, I had this regularity. What is the right underlying model for it? That's science. And although I have colleagues, there was a paper in Nature last December about automating chemical synthesis, like having an AI actually have the AI not just do all the chemical lab experiments, actually also to figure out what was the most lucrative lab experiment to do, or which was the right procedure for doing it. Automating science is something which is on the horizon, not there yet. But I do think that a big bottleneck with age-based modeling is trying to figure out what are the relevant behavioral rules, certainly. But I also think that the way the social scientists have approached it in the past, it's not crazy. We're going to say, we're just going to parameterize the rules with some numbers, and then we're going to use the data to figure out what the numbers are going to be. And a crappy model will only explain part of the variance. A good model will explain most of it. And I don't think that age-based modeling is really any different from microeconometrics in that way. That microeconometrics is going to be a model of why people do what they do, and then we use the data to estimate the model. I just think that it turns out there is terminology in another branch of the science where we say about, what if your model's wrong, right? What if you have a model, what if there's a structural break in your model? What happens if the structure of the model is inherently wrong? Always you're going to have a crappy ability to predict stuff, right? I don't know if there's any kind of silver bullets on the horizon for that. My personal feeling is that LLMs are not the silver bullet, just because imagine we have every agent have its own LLM. My feeling is that an LLM is perfectly useful at qualitatively explaining to me something that I don't know much about. But it's not very good at telling me about it wouldn't be able to tell me what I'm going to have for lunch tomorrow. It wouldn't be a very good job of forecasting that. It's not going to do a very good job, I don't think, predicting like consumer behavior, which is we can get that down to something like 1%. We have good forecasting ability now to get that to high verisimilitude. So I don't think LLMs, it's not obvious they're going to help us there. Or even if they did, we wouldn't know why they're working so much. Anyways, I don't think I'm not sure that's a dead end, but like some people have said, but I also don't think it's going to be that helpful. And as you guys know, LLMs are all full of things like hallucinations, et cetera, that are hard to know in advance. But maybe that in a world of infinite computing, it may be the case that every agent has its own neural network. I'm fine with that. But I'm not sure that it's going to look like a transformer at that point.
We have 2 questions left. The first of those 2, if you had to choose one area, going back to your idea of, one of the biggest challenges knowing what problem space to be operating in, where in the next, let's say, 10 to 20 years do you think agent-based simulation might be most impactful?
Okay, so speaking from my own expertise, John, I'm going to have a very definite answer for you. I'm going to try to justify it as something which is a way to go. It's not the only way to go, but it's a way to go. I do think in the next decade or two, we are going to see for the first time, in essence, what Brian Arthur and Mitch Waldrop, I'm not sure who actually used the word, but in the book Complexity from 1992, when Waldrop wrote this about the kind of up-and-coming SFI, those guys said, what if you could have an economy under glass? Because once you had an experimental laboratory, in this case computational, where you would say, I have a 330 million consumer economy, size of the U.S. economy. That economy has got 6 million business firms in it. It's one-to-one scale with the real economy. Now, it may make no sense to do it for the U.S. Maybe you want to do Latvia, Lithuania, or Liechtenstein first. I don't know. But the point is, the idea of building an ultra-high fidelity model at a one-to-one scale, and we probably need to make a new term for this, because this is not really macroeconomics anymore. It's really something like a synthetic economy, or I'm totally happy with economy under glass, but it's not very scientifically sounding. But the idea of let's build a model with all the relevant pieces in there, and now, instead of having to conduct, like, you're going to try a new tax policy, it's going to take you like 6 months to get it passed, and then a year to get it going, and then 4 years to figure out what the effect on the deficit is, et cetera. You're going to be able to figure out what's going to go on with that tax policy in the next 5 minutes.
Right.
That strikes me as being a game changer in a way that we can use our modeling approach to a whole new and greater capability for not just the U.S. and for civilized people, but also just for humanity in general.
Mm-hmm.
You can have a much more fine-grained understanding of what's going to happen now. But now my libertarian friends at George Mason and beyond are going to get upset at me. They're going to say, if you can do that, if the government can do that someday, won't they be able to control our lives? And that's not what I'm saying at all. I'm just saying that we already do. People already try to do what I'm just describing. We just do it badly, right?
Sure.
We say, like, let's change the corporate income tax rate from 35% to 28% to 21% or whatever. And they just have no idea that there's all kinds of side effects associated with that. And these people are going to move their operations to the Cayman Islands, and this money actually will not come back from Ireland or whatever. All these things are going to happen, and they have just no way. And they're just making it's just total guesswork as to what will happen. We can at least have some principled way. We can say our prediction is this. Then you can still try the policy and see, okay, the prediction is only half right or only 3/4 right, and what didn't work, and you can get a better understanding of how the whole thing works from looking at it ex post. But I think that we would never, even though Brian Arthur and Mitch Waldrop discussed this in 1990, 91, 92, it comes out in the book Complexity, we still have never realized it. We still do not have this kind of complete autonomous economy running on a machine somewhere. And that's going to be doable here in the next decade or so.
Final question. So for people that are interested in getting into agent-based simulation, some come from a social science background, other from a computer science background. If you're talking to a high school student, they might be getting interested in pursuing an undergrad or a graduate degree. What might you recommend them get into that's a good on-ramp into agent-based simulation?
That's interesting. I do oftentimes counter the following situation, and I'll report the pros and cons of it, is that people come to me with very good net logo skills, hoping to be able to do research with NetLogo. Now, for those people listening to the podcast who don't know NetLogo is a very capable, very friendly, very, to be totally honest, very pleasant piece of software to work with, even though it has non-trivial semantics and syntax. It is I think, the NetLogo software, which is free and has a robust models library, is a very nice on-ramp to agent-based modeling. The main con I'll say about it is that once again, if you become too facile at NetLogo, it can become a limitation, because you then say, I have to go over to write my own code in Python or Java or C or something. So that's a lot more work. And it's true, it's a lot more work. You're going to get a big performance increase out of it, and you can really do research with the other thing. But certainly, I think for high school students, John, and even for undergraduates, NetLogo is a great on-ramp. You can see applications in the natural sciences, the social sciences. You can see colorful models for which the visualization is important, numerical models for which some data analysis is important. I think so. NetLogo has done a great service to our community, and of course, as it's based on a pedagogy of Star Logo or earlier educational languages at MIT, trying to get kids to learn how to program, et cetera. Right. So it comes out of that tradition. It can today be used for small-scale research projects. It's just not the right vehicle particularly for the kinds of things that I've been talking about earlier in our conversation, large-scale models with high verisimilitude. It's probably not the right approach. But certainly, anybody who's listening to the podcast who wants to get their fingers wet with ABM, the free software called NetLogo is a great place to start. And for example, it's actually how we teach ABM to undergraduates. At George Mason, we have an undergraduate course. By the time we get to my graduate course, I recommend people do not use NetLogo just because they're not going to use it in their own research. But it's great for the non-specialists and for people who are just getting in, I think.
Cool. Rob, thank you so much for jumping on. There's a lot of good context in here for people.
Enjoy that, John. Thank you so much for having me. Really appreciate it.